Yes, so thanks very much. It falls to me to introduce Dr. Oli Belas from the University of Bedfordshire. You'll notice in his bio that we circulated via Eventbrite that it was particularly terse. And it didn't really do justice to the Renaissance man that Oli is. So I'm going to do one of those things where I give you three facts about him, and you've got to decide which two are true. So Oli is also a podcaster. Recently, with the Bedford branch of the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain, he started up a podcast called Ed Space, which you can find on Spotify or whatever your favourite podcatcher is. He is a competitive strongman and an astronaut. So there you are, you choose. And I'm going to introduce. Thanks very much, Oli.
Yeah, I don't quite know how to follow on from that. So the presentation will be even more terse than the abstract. If you have read the abstract, it's probably only right that I say that the Rocky films didn't make the final edit of this presentation. Yeah, just for reasons of length. I'm also going to say that usually I wouldn't read. I wouldn't just read at people, but I find this talking into a screen strangely disconcerting. So I'm going to be mostly reading, partly because it gives me a sort of security blanket. Also, though, because most of what I've got to say has to do with the importance of writing to English studies. And also, it's true that in both my teaching and my research recently, I've been thinking a lot about essay writing as a creative practice, and also the ways in which writing sometimes sits awkwardly in the space, sometimes occupied by so-called method or methodology. So it seemed sort of more honest in a way to share a piece of writing with you. In case you don't like being read at, I video called with my young nephew recently and to read to him, and then got to watch him as he slowly fell asleep. If you don't like being read at, I hope it's worked, I've shared a version of the paper through the chat function. So if you want to have it in front of you, if you want to refer to it afterwards, it's there for that. It's there for that purpose. The last little bit of housekeeping is just to say that that this is part, as Andrew said, this is part of a larger book project, and some version of this is probably going to form chapter 1. So in a sense, I'm sort of setting out my stall here, and to begin with, positioning myself relative to some, I would say, fairly familiar debates in English and education studies. Okay, I'm going to start reading now. For many of us, our sense of literature, what it is and what, if any, cultural importance it might have beyond the classroom, will have been shaped by our experiences of English at school and possibly at university. Experiences which have themselves been affected by a longer history of English as a schooled subject. And this schooled context is just one means by which literature, what Jacques Derrida called a strange because institutionalist institution, has been institutionalized. And it's in this schooled context that English literature seems at times to have something of an identity problem, chiefly because of the difficulty identifying just what English is, scare quotes, about, what that is the subject teaches or invites its students to do and to be. As Robert Eagleston and I have both argued before, but independently of one another, in the case of English literature, one cannot easily draw a straight line from the school or university subject to a particular disciplinary identity. Whether sciences, mathematics and history, for example, invite us to become scientists, mathematicians, historians, or at least to play at being these, English does not, as Eagleston points out, invite us to become Englishers. It's tempting to say, though, that English literature's so-called identity problem is more to do with the conventional limits of language than any deep-rooted disciplinary problem. Why not insist that schooled English does in fact train up would-be Englishers until Englisher, Englishist and other derivatives would catch on? There are surely some people who'd make a considerable saving on words were they able to dismiss this or that literary platitude as nothing more than an Englishism. Perhaps the identity problem we Englishers face is no more than a case of bad labelling. English language, after all, does introduce its students to the study of linguistics and invite them to become or play at being linguisticians. Creative writing, in similarly obvious fashion, introduces its students to various forms and traditions of creative writing and invites them to become or play at being creative writers. And possibly oracy, were it given more curricular time and attention, would invite its students to become or play at being orators. Now, Eagleston's solution to English's identity crisis is to say that English literature is in the business of turning out literary critics, and certainly a rebrand from English literature to literary or perhaps even textual criticism would have some advantages. Literary criticism would name the subject for its central practice rather than its object of study. And textual criticism might even put a bit of distance between English literature understood on the one hand as critical practice and taken on the other as the name of a vaunted institution or a so-called great tradition and the study or appreciation of that. Such worn-out terms of phrase as the great or the literary tradition, transcendent or timeless literature, all these are problematic because of the tendency to speak of them as if aesthetically innocent, as if the tag great literature and others like it were a mark simply and only of aesthetic value, and if aesthetic value were a non or ahistoricable and isolable quality residing somehow in those artworks that make up the tradition. I don't think thinking about meanings being in text is actually very helpful most, if not all of the time. It's not that there's no such thing as great literature, nor that there's no such thing as aesthetic affect, nor that there's no such thing as tradition. One can hardly imagine any academic discipline being able to do without the notion. The point, and it's a simple one that ought not, I think, be controversial, is that literary traditions and the canons which embody them are the product of political and aesthetic choices. Traditions are always, as Raymond Williams observed, selective traditions which reflect structures of common feeling, sensibilities which the critic identifies, whether or not they themselves identify with them, and then attributes to that tradition. The fallacy of aesthetic innocence, if and where it's accepted, silences discussion about the processes of inclusion and exclusion by which canons and their traditions are necessarily made, and it perpetuates the lie that aesthetics is apolitical and politics anesthetic. Canons and the traditions for which they stand are produced at the confluence of the aesthetic and the political, and the idea that these could ever be entirely hived off one from the other has been challenged by numerous writers and artists working at and in very different times, contexts, and traditions. William Blake, Robert Browning, W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, Ernst Cassirer, Theodore Adorno, Audre Lorde, Amiri Baraka, Hélène Cixous, Jacques Rancière, Angela Davis, Robin DiAngelo, Adrienne Rich, Ava DuVernay, Derek Walcott, Susan Sontag, Hans Ulrich Gumbrech, James Baldwin, Jacqueline Woodson, to list just a few. To stop thinking of English literature as English literature and to start thinking of it as textual criticism would then be to realign the subject with what, in Bob's view, is its central practice. And doing that would make the subject first and foremost an exercise in the craft of essayism, a selective tradition far older than the subject of schooled English. The essay as a form is about as well or ill-defined as is literature itself, and it's striking that those who write about the essay as a literary form, even as they write about its capaciousness and its mercuriality, tend not to consider the academic essay, probably because it seems as a matter of principle to exclude the freewheeling subjectivism that some will likely associate with creative writing generally, the historical emergence of the essay particularly, and which will seem again to some the opposite of so-called critical distance. And it's of course academic or expository writing that many, in particular students, will associate in near Pavlovian fashion with the word essay. Now, the expository essay, says the preamble to an American university's webpage on essay writing, this is a quote now that's in the first box there, requires the student to investigate an idea, evaluate evidence, expound on the idea, and set forth an argument concerning that idea in a clear and concise manner. This can be accomplished through comparison and contrast, definition, example, the analysis of cause and effect, etc. Now here's a paraphrase, and I've put this up in the other box. Here's a paraphrase and summary of the guidance that follows. Use the 5-paragraph formula, which is straightforward and easy, but remember that it's not the only formula going. Evidence your claims by supporting what you say with what other people have already said. The expository essay is an art form. The site does use that word, art form. The expository essay is an art form held together by common features, including stylistic conventions of clarity, concision, and quote-unquote readability. And finally, be creative and original in what you say, and try not to sacrifice interest to the familiar or the formulaic. Compare that to bullet point 1. Having said that in a snarky way, there's plenty of serviceable advice here in as much as it reminds you why you're likely to find yourself writing essays as part of your degree in the first place. And moreover, with its offering of a functional approach to essay writing, the university's guidance is actually not that far from some of the more formulaic approaches well known to the teaching of secondary English essay writing, peel paragraphs and that sort of thing. Those sorts of familiar and formulaic approaches, but which nevertheless for some time teachers, writers, researchers have been challenging and pushing back against. But those glaring contradictions in the university's list, in my summary of the list, and that telling etc. in their preamble, are also reminders that the essay conceived as a writerly form, rather than as a vehicle of assessment, can't be pegged out along strong definitional lines. Neither can any literary form or genre or tradition. As soon as you foreclose possibility through stipulation, which so often is an entirely reasonable pedagogical act, I find myself doing it all the time, you find yourself compelled to open the way for exception. In the university's guidance, style is less prominent than perhaps I've made it seem in my list. It's actually mentioned in passing in the context of paragraph building and evidencing, and it's likely that some will read the emphases on concision, clarity, and so-called readability as an injunction against style, because it's style that's often thought of as the mark of the personal, and the personal is often that which is supposed to be stripped from academic writing. And Adorno noticed this tendency and attributed it to a positivist hangover, really. Now, in contrast to the university guidance, written style and technical control, which is surely an aspect of style, are stipulated separately in 2 of the 4 objectives in a well-known exam board's GCSE English Literature mark scheme, and jointly in one of the 5 against which another board assesses A-level English literature work. Both exam boards' assessment language is remarkably close, and for both their statements of objectives and the level descriptors that go with them. For both boards, the aim is to respond to texts in an informed and personal way. In the case of the A-level mark scheme, responses should be, quote, informed, personal, and creative. But while personal, and in the case of the A-level document, creative are elements of the assessment objective, neither is mentioned in the level descriptors. What we get there are such words as critical, insightful, and evaluative at the top of the scale, while in the middle, clear, consistent, sustained responses are said to demonstrate understanding of text and tasks, and at the bottom, responses are expected to be narrative and or descriptive, reading superficial or simple. There's not much wrong with these objectives and their descriptors. They actually capture rather succinctly the only reasons one could have, other than the demands of one's schooling, for attempting literary criticism in the first place, either that you have something you want to say about a text you've read, or that you care to work out what you think about a text you've read. What's interesting is first the presupposition that criticality is a mark not of depersonalization and so-called objectivity, but of the personal. And second, that the burden of the personal, is reduced the less we expect from students' work. Again, in many ways, there's not much wrong with this. The descriptors for very good and very bad work actually remind us just how difficult it is to write coherent personal responses at all. And there's nothing mysterious about that problem. Literary criticism is an account of one's brushes or encounters with literature, or, as George Steiner has put it, it's that great discourse with the living dead. Despite the tendency to treat it as such, literature is not a cultural monument or object which can be strongly defined. Rather, as Derrida again has suggested, it's an occurrence, something that takes place in the space between reader and text. Lit happens, we should say with a shrug, and when it does, it happens to us. Steiner goes on to say that, and this is another quote, "To read well is to take great risks. It is to make vulnerable our identity, our self-possession." So it's a high demand that someone have something worth saying and that they say it well. And given that, it's quite right, actually, that GCSE and A-level students should be able to scrape a passing grade by rendering not very much in passably narrative form. But if we're to quibble, and if English literature is in the criticism business, then critics are surely in the quibbling business, it's perhaps worth saying that the terms narrative and descriptive as low-level indicators are ill-chosen. All criticism is narrative and descriptive. Good criticism simply offers better narratives and descriptions than does bad criticism. The difficulty, of course, lies in specifying what better and worse, good and bad mean in such a context, but actually that's captured pretty well in the mark scheme's high-level descriptors. The presumption shouldn't be that students at the bottom of the mark grid will be writing narratively while those at the top won't. It should be that bad work will sub in the writers and the text narratives, disconnected bits of biographical or historical information and plot summary. Bob actually touched on that earlier on. You know, who cares about when Dickens was born or when he died if what you're writing about is Oliver Twist? So they'll sub in those sorts of narratives, where actually stories of the students' own encounters with literature, stories of when lit happened to them, would have been preferable. But the most important thing about the exam board's mark scheme is this: they make it clear that reading is a writer's game. I want to put it another way: textual criticism, the subject formerly known as English literature, is an exercise in style and its development. Several months ago, I had a dream in which my grandma and my granny, my maternal and paternal grandmothers respectively, arrived, I don't know where, it was a dream, wearing the same outfits. And in this dream, when I commented on my grandmothers wearing the same clothes, all that you dress the same, ha ha ha, my maternal grandmother turned to me and said, "Two women may be wearing the same outfits, but only one of us has style." Now, some of you may be familiar with Raymond Queneau's book, Exercises in Style. And one way of describing that text is that it's the same story told in 99 different ways. But the point is that each rendition is, in and of itself, an entirely different story. When we speak of somebody's personal style, we are, perhaps unthinkingly but quite rightly, rejecting the Cartesian inheritance of inside and outside, body and soul, that entire dualistic machinery, which still bedevils our talk and our writing today. Because 9 times in 10, when we're talking about style, we're talking about the ways in which parts, apparently surface adornment, tics, habits, the way someone dresses, speaks, moves and laughs, we're talking about the ways in which those supposed parts somehow act as metonyms or shorthands for the whole. So the lesson here is that Dream Grandma was wrong. Dream Granny did have style. Dream Grandma just didn't think very much of it, which, by the way, wouldn't have been out of character for the real flesh and blood grandma. More to our point, the university guidance wasn't advocating the stripping away of all style, but the adoption of a certain supposedly conventional style. Because style isn't decoration, nor is it a screen behind which the true or the deeper or the real meanings lie. Style is not something to be overcome. It runs all the ways, up, down, inside and outside. Okay, my students are used to me asking them "so what?" not as an attack, but as a cue for something missing in their essays. And so with respect to everything I've said in the last 10-15 minutes or so what? I'm going to share a few things I've noticed in my time as a teacher of English literature, English language, creative writing, and more recently education studies with a particular focus on philosophy of education. So first observation, Year 7 students are often better at writing fiction than Year 11 students, but by better, I mean primarily that Year 7 students are often less inhibited. Possibly, probably, who knows, they haven't lost their feel for narrative to the demands of the PEE or the Peel paragraph. Next point, A-level creative writing students, in the short time that there was such a thing as A-level creative writing, were, in my limited experience, were consistently least good at writing non-academic essays, possibly because writing on demand about something you care about and why it matters is really, really hard. Possibly because all the expository essay writing they'd done up to that point hadn't prepared them for this, because the essay probably didn't seem to them to be a narrative form. Remember that narrative and descriptive are supposedly low-level indicators at GCSE. And finally, the education studies students I've taught for the last couple of years are often really anxious to write about what they think if they can't first find someone who's already said it. They're often uneasy if they're not ventriloquizing somebody else. Peter Elbow's written about the use of free writing exercises and vernacular writing in academic as well as creative writing contexts. And then recently, just this year, in my philosophy of education classes, I've started using free writing exercises as a way of trying to figure out what we think about a topic or question and why we might think it. And when we do that, we all write, teacher included. So to sum this all up, reading and writing, obviously enough, are not opposed or entirely separable activities, particularly in schooled English, where writing is the principal mode of assessment for both for reading and writing. Steiner sees criticism as a conversation with the living dead. Jacques Rancière sees it as writing in the margins of others' work. What Steiner and Rancière say of criticism can be said for any writing that is self-consciously writerly. We're always reading our writing off against our own, possibly inchoate intentions. against those whose voices echo in our work. Literary voices maybe, but also, as the philosopher Charles Taylor, the poet Louis Muniz, and my former creative writing student Lewis have told me in their various ways, the voices of our significant others, parents, siblings, grandmothers who visit us in dreams. But the confluence of reading and writing is perhaps most obvious in the essay, simply because it tends to wear its interpretative acts on its sleeve. At the most general level, it's tempting to say, the essay is an act of thinking out loud and of giving form to our perceptions. Though it's a high demand that students have something to say and that they say it well, I can't imagine this not being something that we educators would aspire to. In education studies, one hears a lot about the importance of student voice, but simply making space for student voice isn't enough. There's a difference that needs to be drawn between the impulse to say something and knowing how to say it. There's no such thing as correct English, but there are, however, contexts in which this or that way of speaking and writing may be more or less effective. And that's why the practice of writing is central to this confused subject or discipline that we call English. Not because it demonstrates comprehension, whatever that might be, but because it just might be a space in which students learn how to formulate, articulate, revise, and challenge their thoughts and feelings. A space in which they develop or might develop increasing control over a language which, yes, they speak, but which also to a great extent speaks them. And in which they might learn how to code switch, how to identify and participate more fluently in the language games they're being asked to play, and perhaps even to learn how to play the ball ever closer to the line. These are all creative and interpretative undertakings, and they need to be fostered over time because that sort of knowledge is hard won and easily lost. Thanks very much. Oh, it's faces. That's nice.
Right, thank you very much, Ollie. I'll give a minute or two for anybody to put any questions up that they might have for Ollie, but we've got one immediately from Katie Limmer saying, could we get references for exercises in style and pointers to free writing activities? I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts on that, Ollie, that you could pass on.
So if by exercises in style you mean if you mean the Raymond Queneau text, then yeah, I can send a link through after I've finished my bit here, and this isn't meant to sound facetious, if you Google it or put it into Amazon, it will come up because that's the name of his book. As far as free writing exercises go, I can take a couple of minutes actually to explain it because the principle is very, very simple. It's not necessarily easy to do, but the idea behind it is very, very simple. Usually there's some kind of a prompt, and that might be, depending on the context, it might be a visual prompt, it might be a quote, it might be a sentence fragment. In the philosophy of education classes that I taught, it was often, a question relating to that week's lecture topic. But the idea is that however much time you've got, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you just write, and you don't censor yourself, you don't edit yourself, you don't worry about spelling, punctuation and grammar, you just write. And it's not uncommon to say that if you really do hit a wall, draw loops on the page until you can get started again, or you keep writing whatever your last word was, but you sort of, even if you really are blocked, you try to keep moving. Side note to that, I think it's really interesting that implicitly acknowledges the embodied activity that writing is. But that's the idea. And I'm going to be a bit bossier next time I get to do it with my students, because some people, I gave them the option of doing pen and paper or computers, because so many people have their laptops with them in class these days, as long as they carried on writing. I said this was going to be brief, didn't I? And it turns out that I lied. So I gave them the option, and I'm convinced that it worked better for those people using pen and paper, because it's so tempting when looking at a screen to edit yourself. It's very, very hard to resist that temptation, I think, because you can easily cut and paste and start reordering things, and you want to avoid that. So I'm going to, unless there's a reason why someone couldn't be using pen and paper next year, I'm going to enforce that. So that's the basic idea behind free writing. But if you want some literature on it, then the PDF that I sent through, I didn't include a reference list, but I did put a very, very select bibliography, and on that there's 2 books by Peter Elbow. and he's the one who's very closely associated with free writing as a teaching mechanism, or as creative writing pedagogy. So there's 2 of his books are on that reference list too.
Thank you very much. And another question from Brianna Gray. I'll read this out. Is there a unique opportunity to emphasise creative writing growth during this shift to digital learning and an increased emphasis on well-being? So I guess looking at whether or not the current situation where everything is moving into different forums for learning provides us with a real opportunity.
In short answer, yes. Slightly longer answer, yes, I hope so. Slightly longer answer is that, and we'll all have had different experiences of this, that the move to online teaching is not just, it's not a move, is it? And anecdotally, all of us have got different stories to tell about the shift to online teaching as teachers, but quite a few of us, me not included, are also now in a position of homeschooling children. And the experience there is interesting because we've got lots and lots of stories of schools that are trying to offer very, very structured, but with that very, very prescriptive programs for online and home learning. And that produces some interesting opportunities, but an interesting raft of problems. We've got other schools that are taking a much more laissez-faire, shall we say, approach for good reason. Dave's commented on this recently in the Twitter sphere, I noticed. And so this is all a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, I think there are lots of opportunities here, depending on what your experiences are of being stuck to a screen, particularly as a home educator or as a student who's trying to go through or engage with online learning. But potentially, yes, there's a big opportunity here, especially with the ways in which this situation has disrupted the assessment regime and the assessment mechanisms.
Well, thank you, Oli. That's really interesting. I've always, as somebody who leads a module and tries to get non-creative writers writing creatively, and some of the pain that goes with that, I'm always interested by the number of people who say, "But I can't write. I can't write," and I try to get them to see that there's a difference between can't write and not writing.
Yeah.
And that often we have people who are saying they can't write, and what they're actually just doing is not writing. And that there's perhaps an interesting distinction to work with there in terms of how we can begin to convince people who are not writing to begin writing, and to get them going on a journey that's likely to have kind of steady accruals in terms of interest and skill and capacity that are perhaps something that they're just really struggling with as a barrier to get through. So thank you, Oli. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
We look forward to hearing more.